goes hand in hand with speech pathology, and getting a hearing assessment is something that a lot of speech pathologists will recommend. And the more I talk today, the more you will understand why that is. Now, a child with a hearing impairment will still learn to speak and can still be given tools to learn how to speak or to learn a different way. Or they might learn a sign language, or they might learn to use augmentative and alternative communication, which is more like a picture or a voice device. But we want to be really on top of hearing skills with all kids, including our kids who are developing typically, so that they don't have any periods of time where they have less hearing skills or a slight hearing loss, even if it's in one ear. If we're staying really on top of it and getting the treatment that they need, if they do have some sort of thing that's affecting their hearing, and I'll go into that a bit later, the earlier we can get onto it, then we know that they're going to have better hearing to be able to learn to speak and to say their sounds accurately. Now, when it comes to a child's speech processing profile, so what I mean by that is how children learn to say each sound and to put those sounds into words and to produce speech. But there is quite a few steps, so there's actually 12 steps to the process in the speech processing profile of a child. And the very first step is hearing, because in order to say sounds, we need to be able to hear them initially. And there are some other steps along the way that are very dependent on the hearing. Of course, all of the steps rely on hearing, but in particular, we hear a sound. We need to work out if it's a speech sound or if it's a non-speech sound. So being able to know that the birds chirping or the lawnmower is a different sound to a speech sound or someone speaking. So being able to really distinguish between those two. And then within knowing that someone is talking, being able to break it down into individual sounds and start to store those sounds accordingly into their brain. Now, of course, children aren't doing this consciously. This is actually a subconscious process that's happening in their brain. And for adults, it happens really quickly if we're adequate talkers and listeners. However, for a child, they're very, very dependent on that hearing skill to be able to then match all those steps together. And there's one really important hearing skill that we have at the end of the process, where we've heard sounds and then we've gone up into the brain storage, and not going to go into the complexities of it, but we've said a sound. Our ears need to be listening to ourselves, and it's called a feedback loop. So we listen to ourselves, and if we've made any kind of error, we work to give that feedback through the ears and then up into the profile again, so that we can make the change if it needs to happen. And this is something you probably do. If your words come out wrong, you feed that back to yourself and then you make that change. And so this hearing skill is very important for children as well. The feedback loop is something that develops over time, and our little ones, like our babies and toddlers, aren't necessarily going to have it yet. They're not always going to pick up on a mistake or an error that comes out, but over time they do develop that awareness. So, if the hearing is impaired at all in our kids, even if it is just mild or it's really slightly delayed, then it's going to affect all of the other steps in that 12-step process. So it becomes a little bit like Chinese whispers. If the hearing's impaired, then they're not quite sure if it was speech or non-speech. They can't quite break down the sounds. Then they're not quite accessing the storage correctly in their brain. They're not necessarily going to choose the right sounds to make with their mouth. And then they're not necessarily going to say the word accurately. And so it's this constant cycle that can really be affected at all steps of the process. Plus, a child with a mild or moderate hearing loss can still hear, and we will often see them be able to go and get their hat when we ask them to, or know that it's bedtime or that it's time to go outside, and they really pick up on cues, and they might still hear the words that you're saying. But something that a lot of people don't know about speech sounds is that different speech sounds have different volumes and frequencies. And so when we look at a hearing impairment, we tend to lose certain frequencies and lose certain volumes. So we might not be able to hear quiet sounds, and we might not be able to hear high frequencies or really, really low frequencies. It can really differ depending on each child. And so if different speech sounds have different frequencies and volumes, then they will become affected when there is a hearing impairment. So for example, a mild hearing impairment might mean that they can hear all sounds except for these three. And as you can imagine, they're really quiet sounds, and it is really hard to make them loudly, to be able to really make that any louder than what it is. So a child with a mild hearing loss might not be hearing those sounds, and so for a word that has any of those three sounds in it, they might not be hearing it all that clearly, but they might hear the rest of the word and then use their problem solving skills and maybe some lip reading to work out what you actually said. And so their hearing impairment is masked. We don't necessarily see that they're having any difficulty with their hearing skills. So it can be really common for a child with a really mild or moderate hearing impairment, or a hearing impairment in just one ear, to go undetected for quite a long time. So in light of all of this, you can see why speech pathologists will always recommend that parents take their kids for a hearing assessment before doing speech therapy, because we really want to be informed. We want to know, what are we working with? Are we working with the hearing impairment so we can modify what we're doing and to help them accordingly, because we don't want to be doing lots of things and not seeing any progress with them. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things. The first one is the newborn hearing screen. So most of your babies would have had a newborn hearing screening within their first few weeks of life. And they may have passed that, which is awesome. And the thing about that is that even if they passed that newborn hearing screening, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have hearing for life. So it's really important that we do really keep on top of these things. There are a couple of things that can happen in our children's ears that can really affect their hearing. Number one is an ear infection. Some kids get ear infections a lot, and the faster we can treat them and really keep on top of them, and speak to an ENT if you're really seeing them coming all the time, because a period of time that your child has an ear infection could also be a period of time where your child is hearing muffled speech or experiencing some sort of damage within their ears that can cause a mild hearing impairment. And the other one is glue ear. So this bit that you can see here is called the outer ear, and then you've got an eardrum, or what we know as an eardrum, and then there's a middle ear, and there's actually an inner ear as well. Now, glue ear is where there's some fluid buildup within that middle ear, and we also call it otitis media. It can go undetected for quite a long period of time, and some children don't experience any sort of symptoms or pain as a result of having that fluid build up there, but what they will be experiencing is muffled speech. And we always like to talk about it in terms of a drum. If you've got a drum and you bang on it, it makes a really great loud noise. If you put water on that drum and then you bang it, it'll make a different noise. It'll make a more muffled noise. So it's really important to understand that if your child is experiencing glue ear, then they are likely having muffled speech coming in, which means that what they're hearing is not quite clear. So as you can imagine, if you think to that 12-step profile, they're not quite going to be mastering every step of that profile, or might not be saying their sounds clearly because they're just saying what they are hearing, which is a muffled version. So hearing is very important. I am going to talk about a couple of red flags to really look out for when it comes to hearing. So number one is if your children are rubbing their ears a lot, or if they're experiencing pain or any discharge coming out of their ears, please go and talk to your GP or go and see an ENT. If they're not responding at all to you, they don't seem to hear their name or your voice, They don't get excited when they hear dad's voice when they come home or something like that. Or if they're not responding when it's really noisy. So they might hear you when it's quiet, but they might not be able to hear you across noise. For example, if the TV's on or you're vacuuming, and I mean, that's hard enough as it is, but it's really important that kids are still able to hear those voices within noise. And if they're not startling to really loud noises, that's definitely a red flag. And if their speech is very unclear or they're very delayed with their vocabulary. So those tend to be our real key indicators. But I want you to really think about it. Is your child really understanding and hearing you all the time? What's their speech like? What is their vocabulary like? There's no harm in getting a hearing assessment if you just want to rule that out and make some decisions around that. So I hope that gives you lots of information about hearing. It is so important and something that speech pathologists will always talk about and recommend prior to getting any sort of speech therapy.